This was never random. You didn't just happen to be there. There was no coincidence, no luck, no accident. Something pulled you, and not with words, but with a force deep within your soul, a silent tug, leading you straight to a soul who was breaking quietly, a light almost gone. They didn't scream, they didn't beg, but heaven heard. And while everyone else kept walking, you stopped, even if you didn't understand why, even if it made no sense, because your spirit recognized something no one else could see, a presence, a calling, a silent cry buried beneath a perfect disguise. There were no signs in the sky, no voices in the wind. But still, you knew. You didn't plan this, you didn't ask for this, but your soul had already said yes, because you, chosen one, were sent. Sent into a moment of divine timing, not to preach, not to fix, but to witness, and to carry a mission that no one else could fulfill. A mission that would ask you to pour light into a vessel that forgot it was holy, to save a fallen angel, in silence, without recognition, without glory, but with purpose. This is not a coincidence. This is not just a video. This is confirmation. If something inside you just woke up, that quiet fire in your chest you can't explain, then you already know. Comment 99 below. Not for me, but as a spiritual signal to heaven that you receive the message. Like this video to mark your agreement. Subscribe if you know your journey isn't done, because what's coming next was written long before you arrived here. And it's finally time to remember why you were sent. They weren't just a friend. They weren't just a stranger, a partner, or a passing connection. No, they were a divine link, placed on your path with surgical precision by hands you couldn't see, but that you've always felt. You didn't meet them. Your soul was sent to them. And the assignment? It wasn't printed in a letter. It didn't arrive with instructions. There was no angel standing at your door saying, "This one is sacred, protect them." But deep in your gut, you knew. There was something in them, something holy yet wounded. A voice that once sang with heaven, now reduced to whispers and silence. And yet, you heard them. Even when they said nothing at all. You felt their battles, you sensed their shadows, and though they smiled, you saw the cracks. While everyone else believed the mask, you read the soul. This wasn't empathy. This wasn't kindness. It was alignment. You were not just being nice. You were on assignment. And here's the secret few will understand. Your spirit signed the contract before your birth. Before you ever took your first breath, this connection, this mission, this soul was written into your destiny. That's why you couldn't look away. That's why walking away didn't feel right, even when your mind begged for peace. Because this wasn't about logic. This was about divine orchestration. A call from heaven, hidden inside your compassion. They didn't ask for saving. They didn't cry for help. But their silence reached the ears of the Almighty. And you were sent as the response. Not with loud words, not with sermons, but with presence. Because sometimes God doesn't send a preacher. He sends a presence, a heart, a light. You. You didn't fix them. You anchored them. You didn't change them. You reminded them of who they were, who they still are. You held space for a light that everyone else called a problem. You guarded a flame that nearly went out. And here's where the mystery deepens. Why you? Why did you feel that sudden urgency for someone you barely knew? Why did your soul leap even when your mind said, "Let it go"? Why did they appear in your life at that exact moment, when your own world was shaking too? Because it wasn't just about them. It was about you. The mission wasn't only to save, but to awaken. Heaven knew. If you could see the divine in a fallen angel, you'd remember the divine in yourself. It was a mutual ignition. One soul flickering in silence, another soul carrying fire. And when you met, the flame returned. But it gets deeper. Because what if that person, that silent soul you rescued, wasn't the only one assigned to you? What if this was only the first ripple in a much greater plan? What if you've been doing this all along without even knowing it? And what if, even now, there's another soul about to cross your path, waiting for your light again? Stay with me, because what comes next might shake everything you thought you knew about your past, your connections, and your purpose. The signs were always there. You just didn't know what you were seeing. Until now. They didn't scream. They didn't beg. They didn't collapse in public for the world to see. They simply faded. Faded into the background. Faded behind polite smiles. Faded into a life that looked fine on the outside, but was suffocating on the inside. This was not a loud fall. This was a silent descent, and because it wasn't dramatic, no one noticed. But you did. Because what everyone else saw as strength, your spirit recognized as survival. And survival isn't peace. It's camouflage. They were never okay. They were just invisible in plain sight. A soul once radiant, now dimmed by the weight of a world that never understood them. You could feel it before they spoke. Before they shared a single word. That ache, that subtle flicker behind their eyes that said, I used to believe in something more, but now, I'm just trying to get through the day. This wasn't just depression. This wasn't just sadness. This was a divine being, disconnected from their own light. A celestial assignment, crushed by rejection, muted by betrayal, buried under expectations that were never meant for them. They weren't built for this world. That's why it broke them. They spoke softly, moved gently, dreamed wildly in silence. And yet everything around them told them to stop, to dim, to blend, to hide what was holy. And so, they stopped shining. Not because they weren't worthy, but because no one ever told them their wings were still allowed to open. Until you. You saw it, didn't you? That divine residue in their energy, that ache that had nothing to do with this lifetime, that purity that seemed ancient, otherworldly. This wasn't just a person. This was an angel who forgot who they were, and heaven sent you not to fix them, but to find them, because angels don't always fall with fire and thunder. Sometimes they fall in silence, in slow, invisible agony. And when they do, God doesn't send an army. He sends a witness, a companion, a soul like yours. You were the one who noticed what others ignored. You felt the dissonance. You picked up on the divine signals in their laughter, in their hesitation, in their hunger for something they couldn't name. They didn't know how to ask for help, but you didn't need them to. Because this wasn't about words. This was about recognition, spirit to spirit, light to light. And now here's the revelation. What if this angel didn't fall on accident? What if their descent was part of a higher design? What if they had to fall so you could remember you were sent? Because in saving them, you saw yourself. You remembered the times you faded quietly, when your wings were clipped by the weight of the world. And suddenly, this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about both of you. Two divine lights, meeting not in perfection, but in divine collision. And now, there's something heaven wants to show you. Something about why this angel was placed in your life at that exact moment. Something you couldn't have predicted. But that will make everything make sense. Stay with me. Because what's coming next will change the way you look at every soul you've ever carried. The truth is unfolding, and you're right in the center of it. They had almost convinced themselves that God forgot them, that maybe they were too broken, too far gone, too abandoned to be remembered. They smiled in public, laughed when they had to, played their role, but deep down, They were unraveling, not with anger, but with exhaustion. The quiet kind that whispers, maybe I wasn't meant to make it. They weren't angry at God. They were disconnected, spiritually numb, fighting battles no one could see, and secretly wondering why heaven had gone so quiet. Where were the answers, the signs, the purpose? They prayed once, hard, but nothing shifted. So they stopped. They stopped asking, stopped hoping, stopped believing that anyone was coming. And that's when you appeared, not with fire, not with thunder, but with presence, with kindness, with light. You didn't come to perform a miracle. You became the miracle. And the wildest part? You didn't even know you were doing it. You just spoke. You just listened. You just showed up. But in doing so, you reignited something they thought was long dead. You weren't just a comfort. You were a confirmation. Proof that God had never left them. Proof that their cry, though silent, had still reached heaven. And your arrival? It wasn't random. You didn't find them. You were sent to them right at the edge. That dangerous sacred space between surrender and collapse. At the exact moment when they whispered, God, if you still see me, send a sign. You were the answer. Heaven didn't send a sermon. He didn't send lightning. He sent you. Not to fix their theology. Not to rescue them with eloquent words, but to be the reminder that someone still sees the beauty they buried, that someone still recognizes the divine spark inside them, that someone still cares. Because when people lose their faith, they don't need to be preached at. They need to be seen. And that's what you did. You didn't try to change them. You reminded them of who they already were. You saw the light beneath their ashes. You spoke to the royalty hidden under the rubble. And that shook them. Because how could a stranger look at their brokenness and still call it sacred? How could someone walk into their darkness and act like it was still holy ground? But that's exactly what happened. Without even realizing it, you became a lighthouse, not shouting through a megaphone, just standing, glowing, anchored. And from the outside, it looked like a simple interaction, a conversation, a gesture, a moment. But on the inside, their entire world began to shift. Their heart whispered, maybe I'm not invisible. Maybe God still has his eyes on me. Maybe this is not the end. And in that tiny moment, faith flickered again. It wasn't a fire yet, but it was enough. Enough to take one more step, enough to lift their head, enough to breathe again, not just to survive, but to remember. And now here's the question that haunts the silence. What if that one moment saved their destiny? What if their story, that would have ended there, is now only beginning because you obeyed a pull you didn't even understand? What if God didn't just send you to reignite someone else's faith, but to awaken your own calling? Because something is coming next. A moment that will not only validate everything you've ever felt, but expose just how many lives are attached to your obedience. You were sent to one. But what if one was just the beginning? Stay with me. Because what you're about to realize next will reframe every connection you've ever questioned and open your eyes to the real reason heaven keeps putting certain souls in your path. There's something about you you've never been able to explain. You've always walked through life feeling everything. Not just your own pain, but the pain of others. Not just your emotions, but emotions that came out of nowhere. Heavy waves, silent storms, invisible weights. You felt sadness without a story. You felt battles you couldn't name. You carried grief you didn't earn. And for the longest time you thought, what's wrong with me? But there was nothing wrong with you. There was something divine about you. Because what you called a burden was actually evidence of your assignment. You weren't born to blend. You were born to sense, to carry, to heal, to intercept. While others walked through the world untouched, you walked through it, activated. Your heart worked like a radar. picking up signals no one else noticed, sensing things they couldn't see, feeling when a room shifted, knowing when a soul near you was silently screaming. You tried to ignore it, tried to shake it off, but the sensitivity never left. That's because it wasn't sensitivity. It was spiritual equipment. You were wired for a mission, an unseen one, a calling that required you to feel beyond the surface. That's why you couldn't sit still in spaces that felt fake, why you felt exhausted after small talk, why you felt drawn to certain people and completely repelled by others, even if they'd never wronged you. Your soul was reading things your mind couldn't explain, because you don't just exist, you operate, you carry something, and heaven knows it. When God assigns someone to carry light, He also gives them a spiritual sensitivity that most won't understand. You were never too much, you were highly tuned. You weren't weak, you were sent. And that's why they found you. The broken, the hidden, the ones who didn't know how to say help. But somehow, you heard them anyway. That's why they opened up to you. That's why they spilled their soul in the first conversation. That's why strangers felt safe telling you their childhood trauma without knowing your last name. Because your presence carried something sacred. It didn't just listen, it healed. You weren't sent to lecture them. You were sent to restore atmosphere. And the craziest part? You thought this was just normal. You thought everyone could feel what you felt. You thought everyone's spirit shook when they passed by someone in pain. But no, this was your gift. You're not just empathetic, you're prophetic. You don't just care, you carry. You carry fire. You carry breakthrough. You carry divine insight. You carry the type of presence that shakes chains off people without saying a word. That's why they found you. That's why you couldn't walk away. Even when it hurt. Even when it cost you. Even when it drained you to show up again. Because deep inside your soul recognized the assignment. You didn't stay because it was easy. You stayed because it was encoded into your being. And here's the part that's going to crack something open inside you. What if you've been living beneath the weight of your anointing, without realizing it? What if every emotion you called a flaw was actually a frequency, tuned perfectly to divine encounters? What if the very thing that made you feel different all your life was the evidence that you were chosen? Because once you start to see it, once you realize this wasn't just random sensitivity, but a heavenly setup, you'll stop apologizing for who you are. You'll stop trying to numb the gift, and you'll start walking in the boldness of someone who knows they were assigned. And here's the most urgent part. There's something else attached to your life. Another layer, another weight, another assignment that has already started moving toward you. You don't know it yet, but it's on its way. And when it arrives, you'll need everything you've carried until now, because the next soul that's coming isn't just broken, they're chosen too. But they forgot. And heaven is trusting you to help them remember. Are you ready? Because what comes next will test everything you've ever believed about your sensitivity, your purpose, and your legacy. There are no accidents in the architecture of heaven. No misplaced moments. No random meetings. No by-chance conversations. We like to call it coincidence, because it's easier to believe the universe is chaotic than to accept the terrifying beauty of divine orchestration. But the truth is, your steps were ordered. Your timing was divine. And that soul you crossed paths with, that wasn't a detour. That was the mission. They weren't just part of your day. They were a chapter in your scroll, a pre-written page in your purpose. And while you may have felt unsure, awkward, or unprepared when you met them, heaven wasn't. Heaven knew exactly what it was doing. You didn't arrive early. You weren't too late. You walked into that moment at the exact second eternity had circled in red. You thought you were just being kind, just being available, but you were fulfilling a heavenly alignment. That soul, that angel who had fallen silently, who had lost their way, whose light was flickering out, was not an interruption in your journey. They were the reason for it. Because what you saved wasn't just a person. You saved a path. You rescued a future. You reached into the fog of spiritual confusion and pulled someone back into clarity, back into alignment, back into their original identity. And here's what most people miss. When you step into your assignment, you don't just touch a life. You shift timelines. You realign destinies. You alter bloodlines. You interrupt generational patterns. You didn't see the ripples, but heaven did. Because the one you rescued, they were carrying others. And when their light came back on, they became a light for someone else. That one random moment became the divine tipping point for an entire chain reaction of healing. And you thought it was small, but it was never small. It was strategic. Your presence was the exact medicine their soul needed. Not because you're perfect, but because you were available. Because your spirit answered a call your mouth never even heard. And that's what made it so powerful. You didn't force anything. You didn't control the outcome. You just showed up in obedience to something you couldn't even name. But God knew. He saw the moment before either of you were born. He knew exactly where they'd fall. And he knew exactly who could reach them. Not the loudest, not the most educated, not the most eloquent, but the most chosen, you. Because God knew that when this soul was on the edge, when they were about to shut the door forever, when the silence became unbearable, you would walk in, not by luck, not by coincidence, but by divine strategy. You were not the answer to their prayer. You were the answer to God's plan. And that's why you couldn't ignore it. That's why it kept tugging at your heart. That's why you couldn't just move on when others told you to let go. Because your soul remembered what your mind forgot. This wasn't random. This was sacred. And now, as you look back at every moment, every whisper, every strange pull towards someone you didn't even know how to help, you're starting to see it, aren't you? The patterns, the setups, the strategy. You didn't just stumble into their storm. You were assigned to walk in carrying heaven. And here's what's even more incredible. If heaven was this intentional before, what does that say about what's coming next? Because this wasn't a one-time mission. This was training. This was activation. This was God revealing your function in a world starving for light. And just when you think the assignment is over, the real mission begins. There's another moment already forming, another soul being prepared. And guess who's being positioned for it? You. Get ready. Because what's coming next will demand more of your light, more of your boldness, and more of your divine awareness than ever before. But this time, you'll walk in knowing who you are. You're not just a helper. You're not just a healer. You're not just a kind soul passing by. You are a strategy in motion. This was never just a moment. This was never just a video. This was a summons. If something inside you burned, broke, or awakened, it's because your spirit remembers. You've always known. Deep down, beyond logic, beyond language, that you were never ordinary. You didn't just pass by pain. You felt it. You heard it in silence. You saw it behind eyes that pretended everything was fine. Because you were sent, planted, positioned, hidden in plain sight, until the right soul needed your light. And now the veil has lifted. Now the truth is loud. You weren't the one in need. You were the one assigned to lift what others buried, to love what others abandoned, to stand between collapse and redemption and say, "Not on my watch." That was never coincidence. It was strategy. It was trust. It was God choosing you. So the question is no longer, why do I feel so much? Why do I attract the broken? Why do I carry so much for people I barely know? No. Now the question becomes, how will I walk now that I know who I am? Because now, you've been activated, awakened, confirmed. You didn't imagine it. You weren't being too sensitive. Heaven has been speaking, and this is the echo of your calling. So hear me, chosen one. You carry fire. You carry alignment. You carry answers for souls who don't even know what they're searching for. You're not weak, you're wired for warfare. Not the kind fought with noise, but the kind fought with presence, with grace, with holy weight. So rise now, walk differently, speak differently. See every encounter from this moment on as divine, because it is, because you are. And if your soul is roaring yes right now, if something eternal inside you just locked into place, then don't stay silent. Comment this below. I was sent, and I remember why. Let heaven see it. Let darkness tremble. Let the next assignment hear you coming. And if this word found you, share it with someone whose light is flickering. They may not know it yet, but you might be their confirmation. This isn't the end. This is the activation. Now go. Carry the fire. Shift the atmosphere. Move like the one who was sent, because you were, and you always will be.